Everything that humans can imagine is a possibility in reality. This is what we were told at the start of the Skypiea saga. And by the end of the saga, the truth of this statement is captured in one final powerful image. Luffy, having done the impossible and reached the sky, now casts a giant shadow across the world, symbolizing the limitless potential of Luffy as the ultimate dreamer. In a saga that heavily foreshadows the true story of One Piece to come, the story of the dancing warrior of liberation who will one day bring the sun, this concluding image was our vision into the future, of what Luffy would one day become. Today it's not just symbolic that Luffy's imagination makes him limitless. Today, that power has very literally become reality. Having awakened the Nika fruit, Luffy can now genuinely fight as freely as he likes, very literally in whatever way he imagines. As Vegapunk explained, devil fruits themselves are mankind's dreams manifested into powers. And in this sense, the Nika fruit is the most devil fruit of all devil fruits. It is the dream fruit itself. And the most terrifying thing about this fruit is that so far, all of Luffy's opponents have in fact been lucky that Luffy has not used the fruit as oppressively as he can. In fact, based on everything we've seen, it seems as though the fruit very literally nerfs Luffy in some ways, by making him take fights less seriously. While the fruit seems to bring out the goofiest side of Luffy, such that he seems happy to fight simply by bringing the imaginative gags he thinks of to life, at the same time, underneath the laughing, mischievous persona of Gear 5th, there is a vengeful warrior that can awaken as well. This is the Luffy that can use his imagination to become an absolute nightmare for anyone that dares to harm those he cares about. That's right, today I'm going to be breaking down how based on every fight we've seen, Luffy has far more power in Gear 5th than he lets on, and has only been showing a glimpse of its potential, thanks in part to the fruit's own influence on Luffy's nature. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this every week. So there's something very interesting about Luffy's two battles with Kizaru. We see the same situation play out twice, of Luffy in giant form grabbing Kizaru. However, the first time Luffy captured Kizaru, he simply throws Kizaru away, unharmed. Something that bothered me a lot initially, as there seemed to be no reason to do this other than for Luffy to have fun. However, the second time, Luffy grabs Kizaru and actually squeezes, casually making the Marine Admiral cough up blood. It was absolutely no mistake that Oda wrote these two identical scenarios with such different actions by Luffy, with Luffy clearly making a different decision based on his mood. See, during Luffy's first battle with Kizaru, where Luffy simply threw Kizaru away, it's now clear that this wasn't just for plot convenience to extend the fight, it wasn't a contrived way to draw out the conflict, rather this was simply due to Gear 5th's natural effect on Luffy's persona. The form very literally nerfs Luffy to fight in a way that's more fun, essentially holding him back from what he could do. The form allows Luffy to use his imagination, but the form also puts Luffy in a good mood. And so as Luffy's in a good mood, the type of battle he imagines is also inherently more lighthearted, at least until something causes his mood to shift. This has been the case in every single one of Luffy's fights so far, against Kaido, against Lucci, and against Kizaru. Don't believe me? Well, let's break down how all the evidence clearly demonstrates that this is the case. To begin with, we know that Zoan fruits have a mind of their own, and in particular, the Nika fruit has an exceptionally independent will, as it has actively managed to evade the world government's clutches for literally hundreds of years. This is no ordinary fruit. And when Luffy first awakens the fruit, it has a drastic effect on his mood and personality. Read the chapter right before Luffy awakens the Nika fruit. In this chapter, Luffy is finally extremely serious against Kaido. The entire chapter of Gear 4th Luffy vs Kaido features an enraged, desperate Luffy, who is taking the situation absolutely seriously. And then the fruit awakens, Gear 5th happens, and all of a sudden it's like Luffy is walking on a cloud. Everything feels different to him. Gone are the intense emotions from a few moments ago. Now he feels light, he feels good. As he says, he genuinely doesn't understand why, but now he feels like having fun. This was most certainly not the case moments ago. While it's true Luffy was having fun much earlier in his fight with Kaido, as the climax approached and Luffy went into Gear 4th, Luffy was clearly no longer having fun. Again, he was angry, desperate, and serious. But then as soon as Gear 5th happens, as Luffy says, for some reason that he himself doesn't understand, all of that is gone now. Now he just feels like having fun. We see something similar with Luffy versus Kizaru. In Snake Man, Luffy's tone, his emotions, his expressions are much more serious. But as soon as he goes Gear 5th, it's as though all he wants to do is mess around. Again, we know for a fact that Luffy could have seriously damaged Kizaru right here, but he chose not to. He chose to toss him away and play with him instead. So what exactly is happening when Luffy is using Gear 5th? Well, it's not fundamentally changing Luffy's personality, rather it's enhancing specific aspects of it. After all, the Nika fruit chose Luffy for a reason. Luffy himself has always been fun and whimsical 95% of the time. It's just that usually he gets more serious when there is a high-stakes personal fight happening. But when his fruit awakens, it seems like Luffy gets high in some sense. Suddenly, even during a formerly serious fight, he feels like having some fun again. That is, of course, until you push him too far, and then the serious side of Luffy will finally come out again, even in Gear 5th. See, what is becoming apparent now is that the euphoric effect that Gear 5th has on Luffy, influencing him to have more fun, to not be so mad, to think of funny jokes to pull off, this is in fact entirely for the opponent's benefit. Luffy can imagine anything he wants in Gear 5th. He can make himself absolutely terrifying. But because Gear 5th puts him in such a great mood, it seems like initially, his state of mind is to always imagine jokes and gags that he can pull on his opponent. He could do things that are a lot more harmful, but he very literally doesn't feel like it. This is proven by the fact that we can very clearly see two different types of attacks that Luffy uses in Gear 5th, gag-based and power-based. And both of these types of attacks correspond exactly to the type of mood he is in, lighthearted or angry. For the sake of the opponent, they had better hope that Luffy stays lighthearted and continues to use gag-based moves, because when he gets angry enough, he switches to power-based. Let me explain what I mean. And if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this every week. And make sure to get your One Piece inspired clothing today in the Morge store. We have hoodies, sweatshirts, and t-shirts. And get your one-of-a-kind puzzle of all major One Piece characters. Link in the description below. So in this video I did earlier, I talked about how it was interesting that the only time we really saw Gear 5th Luffy become serious during his fight against Kaido, he actually didn't use any zany, silly, cartoon gag-style attacks. Rather, the only time Luffy got serious, he used Bajrangun, which is just a giant punch. It's exactly the same as what Luffy used to do with Gear 3rd, or like King Kong Gun in Gear 4th. Unlike everything else Gear 5th Luffy was doing before against Kaido, Bajrangun isn't silly. It's just a huge power move, the biggest attack Luffy can imagine. At the time, I thought this was strange. Why have Luffy fight with all these jokes if the finisher is just a big punch? But now we see a similar trend. While Luffy used a bunch of gags against Lucci, and similarly fought in a lighthearted, silly manner against Kizaru the first time around, the moment Luffy saw what Saturn did to his friend Vegapunk, a clearly angry Gear 5th Luffy used Dawn Gatling, which is again not a gag move at all. Rather, it's pretty much exactly like all of Luffy's past Gatling attacks, which were some of his most serious finishers in the story. Again, it seems that when triggered, Luffy uses Gear 5th for a straight-up devastating offensive attack. No jokes. And finally, when Luffy's really out for blood for his friend Vegapunk, we yet again see him in giant form, only this time it's not to goof around and jump rope or toss his enemies away. It's actually to bring the pain, to genuinely flex his strength and crush his enemies like ants. So the trend that seems to be taking shape is this. Gear 5th is the power of Luffy's imagination. If Luffy's mind goes to a dark place, he can abuse this power in terrifying ways. He can create a fist the size of an island, or he can become a godlike titan. However, the flip side is the form always starts off by putting him in a good mood. Even if the stakes are high, it's just the natural effect the form has on him. As he says, for some reason, I just feel like having fun. So initially, Luffy's lighthearted, default Gear 5th persona is just always going to be thinking of gags and jokes. That's what we see the majority of the fight with Kaido. Even though just a couple of chapters ago, Luffy was enraged and screaming about saving the people of Wano and the pride of the samurai, Luffy now just feels so good when Gear 5th starts that initially all that comes to mind is just funny idea after funny idea on how to mess with this Yonko. Of course, when the time finally comes for Luffy to get serious and he decides to put an end to it, he flexes what he can actually imagine if he stops goofing around, which is just overwhelming, unstoppable power, and Kaido has no chance. Against Lucci, I remember when the fight started, many readers said that Luffy should one-shot him, and yet he didn't. Why? Not because Luffy couldn't, but because Gear 5th puts Luffy in a good mood, and it was simply too much fun for Luffy to not mess around. The entire fight is a series of humiliating pranks on Lucci. But if something triggered Luffy enough to get angry, he could have quite literally devoured Lucci in a second. And finally we have Kizaru, who was the most important case study that proved the truth of how Gear 5th's moods affect Luffy's fighting style. When Luffy first fought Kizaru, it's not that he wasn't trying, it's just that Luffy was in his default, lighthearted Gear 5th mood throughout the fight, which means he generally battled with shenanigans, because that's how he imagines himself fighting in that mood. But the next time around that Luffy fights Kizaru, the moment that Luffy is genuinely triggered, his imagination goes to a much darker place, and he immediately abuses his powers more forcefully than before. Again, to be clear, Luffy himself is never intentionally holding himself back in Gear 5th. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, the form itself clearly holds him back. By inherently putting Luffy in a good mood, Luffy imagines a more funny fight, and that's exactly how the fight plays out. But the moment something pushes him enough to put even Gear 5th Luffy in a bad mood, that's when the true potential of the power to imagine anything, including the power to simply stomp his opponents like insects, becomes reality. I've seen people try to scale Gear 5th, and it's become apparent that we just can't yet. Not when there's such a clear difference in how dangerous the form is when Luffy is in his default lighthearted mood versus when he's actually pushed to get serious or angry. We saw that when Luffy's in a lighthearted mood, even Lucci can survive a couple chapters. We saw that an extended competitive fight against an admiral when Luffy is in a lighthearted mood can suddenly seem one-sided the moment that Luffy is angry. We saw that despite many chapters of back and forth with a Yonko while Luffy was lighthearted the whole time, the battle ended immediately as soon as Luffy's mood switched to serious and he decided to end it. There is just a fundamentally different way Luffy thinks and uses his powers when he is angry, and it is far more brutal. Power scalers may hate to hear it, but the whole point is that this is a form literally based on imagination, which is why the mood Luffy is in very clearly and consistently skews the types of attacks he thinks of. At the end of the day, what any opponent does against lighthearted, laughing Luffy is irrelevant. The nightmare that comes out when he stops joking around is what all the top tiers in the One Piece world need to worry about. So above all else, don't make him angry. You wouldn't like him when he's angry. Now let me know how you feel about the true potential of Gear 5th in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear how Luffy's upcoming fights against Blackbeard and Emu would still be a significant challenge for him despite everything I've said, then you can listen to my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below.